Welcome back. It is 11 after 8 o'clock. This is News and Views on Salon Media. And of course, the first story we will be covering is the national dialogue. We do know that it raised critical issues, criticism, comments. I'm not even sure if there was anything positive to say regarding all of the criticism that was leveled at the dialogue. And it started off obviously with the convention, the 2-day convention, and we understand it was big on talk, and there are people suggesting that lots of talk but no sign of action. Is that what we're going to expect regarding the national dialogue going forward? And the other very pertinent issue as well is, at this point, there is still a question around whether this will be a national convention or a national dialogue, because the official name is still under discussion. And I'm concerned if this is what they're still deciding, to discuss going forward. Is this ever going to get off the ground? Will this just be one of those talk shops going forward? And the other question that has been raised is the cost of this dialogue, or whatever they're going to be calling it, and who is going to be paying? Is it us, the taxpayers, once again? Let's talk with Yeshil Pancha. He's news and investigative reporter at Daily Maverick, and I have no doubt he probably was at the convention over the past 2 days. So let's hear what he has to say. A very good morning to you. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, ma'am. Thank you very much for having me on air.
So correct me here, were you at the actual convention?
Yes, we were in attendance, myself and a colleague.
Okay, I'm one of those cynics, I might add, because I kind of also, the questions I put to you were the very issues that are troubling me as well. And I kind of think about poverty, unemployment, and all of the other issues that is plaguing us as South Africans. And then you hear about all of the figures being bandied about, the cost of the convention and the actual dialogue going forward. Could it not have been put to better use? And over the years, we've had that many talk shops. I mean, when we just go way back to the Zondo Commission and what was spent on that commission and the issues that came out of it, was anything ever addressed regarding the Zondo Commission? And here we're talking about the convention and, of course, the dialogue. But let's hand over to you and hear your thoughts, and perhaps you will be a little more optimistic than I am and give us a bit of good news regarding the convention and obviously the dialogue going forward. Very good morning once again and welcome.
Thank you very much. I will say, just on the notes of the Zondo Commission, that even though we spent R1 billion as a country to have that commission of inquiry, what was critical was the information that came out, as it laid bare the structures and relationships and perpetrators of state capture. The question as to whether there was ensuing enforcement as a result of that is a separate question, but shouldn't take away from the value of the commission itself. The dialogue that occurred on Friday and on Saturday, the national dialogue, is a slightly different animal. There were a huge plethora of issues raised that I think would not surprise any South African. Everything from land to inequality to crime to the failure of our institutions. So very much, a kind of rehash of all of the problems that we're facing already. What wasn't clear, and what my biggest challenge was from it, is what the next steps are. There is another convention planned for next year in, I think it's August. And then we also have, during the run-up to that, a series of community engagements. But what will illustrate whether the national dialogue was worth anything is whether there's any action. And right now, I don't have a high level of confidence that there will be.
So when this was unfolding, obviously there were lots of delegates from all sectors of, I should imagine, civil society, government, the community at large, etc. And all of these issues were being rehashed because these issues have been in the media, in the public space for a very long time. These are things that we've been bemoaning forever and a day. 30 years into democracy, and we're not seeing any change. We're rather seeing the country degrading, and I should say that figuratively and obviously otherwise. Were there any structures or suggestions of structures being put in place or plans put in place to start addressing these issues? Because it seems to me as if government is now really depending solely on civil society and the citizens at large. We are already proactive in our own little areas where we live. We're upgrading. A very small example would be potholes. Lots of little suburbs throughout South Africa are actually taking that on themselves to fix the roads so that they can be safe. That's just one little example. What is the sense that you picked up regarding someone somewhere in one of these discussions suggesting that this is a plan that we need to put in place, almost like a master plan, which is workable for every area of concern regarding the country?
I don't get the sense that there was a kind of singular strategic plan that came across. And the reason for that is quite simply that that is the purview of the state. We do not exist in a country where, despite the fact that citizen-led initiatives take so much responsibility for so many services and so many functions, we don't live in a country where such a large strategic move or such a large strategic plan would be the responsibility of anyone other than the state. The value that I did see was twofold. The first is that during these plenaries, what you had were people with similar concerns who all found themselves in the same room, often from very different parts of the country, different organizations, different aspects of society. And so while everyone is having a voice and airing a grievance, they're also building relationships. And so I think that one of the things that came away from this that was very positive was that you had civil society and the public meet each other in a designated space with similar interests and similar agendas, and that will facilitate and foster broader civil society and public cooperation. So, and to continue with your example, it might be the case that, for example, a community-led initiative in Lens to fix potholes and a community-led initiative in Craighall Park to fix potholes might end up cooperating with resources. Things like that are not out of the possible benefits of this national dialogue. The other value that I saw is that we don't really have a platform as the South African public for the state to really listen. So, if you have a direct complaint, if you have a direct grievance, you might go to law enforcement if it's, related to crime. You might go to a relevant state body, but it's not a publicly aired forum. And one thing that we did see were quite a few people who simply stepped up and spoke to the states and said, these are the issues that we're facing. These are the problems. What are you going to do about it? And there isn't a lot of opportunity for that. So you can kind of think of that benefit almost as though it's talking therapy for the country, I would say. And then the third benefit, which I think maybe I underlooked in my article, was that the national dialogue did demonstrate to some degree the large amount of consensus and togetherness that South Africa still has, despite all of the divisive things that happen in politics and in society, because you had people from every demographic, every economic background, every aspect of society, all together raising the same issues. And there was a strong sense that the things that we maybe perhaps think usually divide us were not doing so at all. We had the same concerns as citizens, and we were all there to raise them together. That's how I felt the delegates who attended presented themselves. And there's hope in that.
Well, I'm glad that you do see a glimmer of hope, very especially being an investigative reporter at the Daily Maverick. It does say a lot, so thank you for that. Let's also understand regarding those foundations, Thabo Mbeki being one of those, that refused or stepped aside or stepped back and didn't want to participate in this convention. Do you think that that was perhaps a very bad decision on their part? Had they attended, do you think more could have been achieved or more ideas being discussed at a perhaps deeper level? Um, whom do you feel was at loss regarding those foundations and those people who refused not to participate?
So, there were two aspects of society that kind of refused participation. And one, were political parties such as the DA and Action SA. And two were certain civil society foundations such as Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the Desmond Tutu Foundation. And I think that there are different losses from both. Would we have seen broader political church involve themselves in the national dialogue? What we might have seen is more efforts to implement the ideas, plans, or strategies moving forward. The DA cited essentially that this was an ANC PR exercise and they didn't need to listen to the ANC anymore. So there's definitely a political loss in not having a broader range of political parties who participated. However, the foundations not participating, there were legitimate concerns about logistics and about planning because this was a very rushed exercise. However, if it is to be what it is, how it's been posited, which is a citizen-led initiative, quite frankly, it shouldn't really matter whether all of the foundations and organizations and political parties, withdrew. The point of this dialogue was for citizens' voices to be heard and for government to then take those concerns, put together a strategy to resolve them and implement. So as long as the representation of the South African public was there, I'm not too concerned about who else was in attendance. And the South African public from every aspect of society was definitely present.
As a journalist yourself, do you agree with the DA, or what are your thoughts on the DA's stance regarding this being a PR exercise of the ANC? I mean, they're part of the GNU, and for them to make a statement such as, I kind of wonder, what do we read into it?
The DA's statement doesn't surprise me, despite them being a part of the GNU. It has not been uncommon during the entirety of the GNU's short life for there to be detractive statements. Some people, particularly from the DA, some people can interpret that as a failure of the GNU. I particularly see it as something that is, one, a sign of a healthy coalition, because you reach a consensus, hopefully, on the important decisions in a coalition, but that doesn't mean that you don't fight in the interim and that you don't disagree. The second is that South Africa, while familiar with coalition politics on a metro and a municipal level very often, this is the first time we've done it nationally in the way that we have. And so there are going to be teething problems and there are going to be disagreements. So I don't think that that's a particular concern. I hope that answered your question, ma'am.
Okay, yes, it does. We also understand that President Cyril Ramaphosa arrived late, probably an hour late for the keynote address. How do you see it, and how was the response from all the attendees at the conference or at the convention?
Sure. Sorry, I just realized I missed answering your other question, which was, kind of related to whether this was an ANC or could be seen as an ANC-led initiative. And I have a poster on my wall that's visible behind me, which is an ANC poster. I don't work for the ANC. My uncle was part of the struggle back in the day, and that's his poster, just to clarify for the view.
Okay.
I I can understand why the perception that it was an ANC-led initiative exists, and there were occurrences that happened that particularly the level of warmth with which many delegates received President Ramaphosa. That said, during the plenaries, which again were the important part, not the public speeches, but the dialogues between the public and the states and the plenaries, there appeared to be zero political motivation or affiliation. It was members of the public, regardless of their politics, raising what was important to them. So while the concern is valid, I don't think that it stands after having attended the national dialogue. And then to your point now about President Ramaphosa running late, as I wrote in my article that was published yesterday, him being an hour late for the keynote address, you can take as a positive or a negative sign. I personally don't think I've attended an event which President Ramaphosa has either led or attended where he has not been late. And this goes back, since before he was campaigning, before he was even running his presidential campaign, or at least 8 years. However, there is something to be said for the fact that he was only an hour late and that he's usually considerably later. But what it illustrates is a broader systemic problem, I think, of the way in which people in power in South Africa think about the public. So there's nothing unique about President Ramaphosa being late. Almost every single political announcement, regardless of what party they come from or who that person is almost never on time. And there's no reason for that. And I think that represents a broader separation between what the political class in South Africa thinks that their role is and their level of accountability to the public. And they think that level of accountability is low.
And very disrespectful, I might add. If other world leaders can get it right, why can't our leaders? Be that as it may, there are local elections around the corner. And how do you believe this might impact those elections?
I'm wary to speculate on how it would have an impact politically. The biggest takeaway that I had for the municipal elections is I think we're going to see, as a result of the national dialogue, possibly more civil society collaboration and more accountability. Because what you have is people from completely different municipalities all around the country finally getting into one room, everyone being given a microphone in turn and raising their concerns. And all of a sudden, you have someone from Munnenberg in the Western Cape, or Khayelitsha and Alex and Actonville, all raising exactly the same issues. And I think what that will do, and what I hope it will do, is it will motivate the populace to realize that the challenges we face are universal, regardless of geography, demographic, race, anything really. And that because of that, we really need to be driving hard for municipal accountability. And I hope that that's the biggest takeaway for the run-up to the elections. I do think that part of the effort of the national dialogue, which is an unspoken effort, but definitely a strategic one, is possibly an attempt by the state to diffuse some of the tension that is going to be brought into municipal elections. So you can have your voice, you can have your words to the states, and things will be less tense when the elections come around.
Let's sincerely hope so. Your takeaway regarding this convention, right at the beginning of the interview, you did indicate positivity, and I'm glad to hear that. But the one thing that does still concern me deeply is the corruption right from the top. and it seems to filter all the way around as far as our politicians, councillors, etc. are concerned, to the point where we're seeing all sorts of different mafias in operation throughout the country, simply because politicians aren't being held to account. There's no action taken against them. We have water mafias, we have construction mafias, you name it, and those mafias are in operation and they're not being brought to book. How strong was the condemnation regarding corrupt politicians and corruption as a whole permeating throughout the country?
My biggest takeaway from the national dialogue, and this is surprising, so there were 9 different plenaries that occurred, each with a different agenda. Some of them were about, the Constitution. One was directly related to crime and corruption. One was on land. One was on poverty and inequality. And we myself and my colleague Nkululeko, we went to every one, and we couldn't stay for the entirety of each one because they were happening at the same time. But something astonishing was that regardless of what the topic of the plenary was, whether it was, for example, land reform, crime and corruption came up as a concern in every single plenary, which means that it's a concern regardless of what the primary motivation for an attendee at one of these plenaries was. It was a problem for everyone. And you mentioned that there are mafias in kind of every sector of society, and I completely agree with that. The challenge for so many of the problems that South Africa faces is that they require the strong institutional capacity and efforts that essentially can only come from the state. There are some political parties who believe that privatization and private-public partnerships are the only way to solve a lot of problems. And it's my personal opinion that certain things should only belong and be in the purview of the state. If you want to look at how badly privatization efforts on critical services can happen, you can go to the United Kingdom and look at the fact that they've privatized their water services, and now some people don't even get water, or they're being charged 400-600% of what they were a few years ago. I believe that critical services should be the purview of the state, but the state needs to reform and implement them properly. And so rather than handing over Transnet or PRASA or any such institution to the private sector, it needs to be reformed. One of the big challenges, though, and this is a governance challenge, is institutional knowledge and institutional strength and resilience is something that takes very often decades to build. I'll cite an example that a colleague of mine gave me recently where, and this was pre-94, but in order to become a town clerk, which is essentially, a city manager, one needed to receive formal education, then become an apprentice town manager. Then you might become a town manager in a small town. And then after 25 years, you might come to manage, say, at Petersburg. And during your tenure at Petersburg, you might see tons of political appointees as the mayor, but the institutional resilience lays in the infrastructure around that town clerk. And so what you have is a strong history of institutional strength. What we've seen and where these mafias in every sector have been able to step in is a gutting of the institutional strength of many state-owned entities or many state services, such as the SAPS. And even if there are effective, willing efforts to reform those institutions, it's not going to be an overnight thing. And this is, once again, the key takeaway from the national dialogue is we all know what the problems are in South Africa. They just need to be fixed. It's not a question of whether we need to analyze or examine them in more depth than we already have. It's the action that's required, not talk.
And that's where we leave it. All I can say to your closing response to me is that if these issues are not addressed now or as soon as possible, the rot is going to run much, much, much deeper. But thank you indeed, Yashil Pancho, news and investigative reporter at the Daily Maverick. Lovely talking to you. God bless.
Thank you for your time. Bless you too. And thank you very much for your listeners' time as well.
It is exactly 8:36. We're moving along right here on News and Views on Salam Media. And our next guest is Alimami Bakr Sanko, co-founder and president of the Sahel Solidarity Campaign Network.